My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Old Testament prophets and kings, and scheming scoundrels too, collected in this book, Exile of the Chosen, God's Heroes from Solomon to Malachi. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended.
Chapter 1, Part 2, Nathan.
Today, Grandfather announced, you'll want to take a few extra pieces of bread and dried food and bring them with you. Are we going on a trip? Zachary asked eagerly. We are. We're going to head out to the stone quarries and see how the stonemasons are coming along.
Nathan's forehead wrinkled into a frown.
Hey, what are you frowning about now? His cousin demanded. You always frown like that when you have questions.
Well, Nathan replied, it's just that it looks as if the temple's already built. What do we need stonemasons for? I thought they were just working on the inside now. Remember, we saw them bring all of that cedar wood for the interior?
Yeah, Zachary agreed. What are the stonemasons working on, Grandfather? You're very observant, Grandfather said with a smile. Yes, the main part of the temple building is complete, and the workmen are working on the interior now. They will cover the wood with gold leaf. However, the plans do not just involve the building with the holy and most holy places. The stonemasons are still working on the surrounding buildings and area. So they're still quarrying stone, although it isn't for the temple itself. There will be a large wall surrounding the courtyard and a lower wall within it. We will need paving stones and chambers around the edge for storage and other things. All of these will require stone. We will be going down to talk to the officer in charge of the stonemasons, and you can see how they do everything.
The boys broke into huge smiles. They loved going on trips with Grandfather. Although they enjoyed singing in the choir and their practice time, and though Korah the Levite in charge was a very nice man, nothing compared to trips with their grandfather. He always told stories as they went. The activity in the rock quarry fascinated the boys. Men scurried everywhere.
Watch carefully, Grandfather said. These are some of the less experienced rock cutters, although they will be more skilled someday as they learn. They're quarrying large blocks of stone. How do they do it? Zachary asked. Look over there, their grandfather pointed. See those wooden wedges? They have to choose the spots where the stone is perfect. They don't want a limestone block with big ugly flaws in it, especially for the temple. Then they drive the wedges into the cracks that they make, and finally they soak the wood with water. Why? Zachary demanded.
Grandfather smiled.
What happens when wood becomes wet?
Ah, the boy remembered.
It swells and expands. That's right. Limestone, when we first find it in the quarry, is fairly soft. The stonemasons are able to use their picks to make a crack. Then, after the men force the wooden wedges in and soak them, the wood expands and widens the crack. The quarry workers can then break out a block of limestone.
Nathan picked up a piece of stone from the ground and rubbed it. Yeah, I guess fairly soft is a relative term, he mumbled.
Grandfather laughed. Yes, it would still feel hard if you bumped your head on it. It all depends on what you're planning to use it for. Once the stone cutters have broken the rock out of the cliff and gotten it into a rough shape, they bring it to this other area.
He gestured over to one side.
Here, the more skilled stonemasons do the fine shaping. They make the pieces so smooth that they fit together perfectly and hold together even without mortar.
This time, neither boy mentioned anything about the pyramids. They knew better.
No, Grandfather said. You two walk around. Watch closely, but don't get in anybody's way. I have to talk to the foreman here, and then I'll be ready to go in a couple of hours. Shoot!
The boys wandered off to explore the quarry. Too soon, it was time to leave. As they sat around their campfire that night, Nathan asked, Are we going back home now?
No, Grandfather answered. I need to stop by the clay pits and talk to the metal workers also.
Nathan's forehead wrinkled again. Another question was brewing. Why are the metal workers in the clay pits? He asked. He was familiar with the clay pits along the edge of the river between the Dead Sea and the Galilee, because his father had come there before, though not to see a metal worker. Grandfather smiled.
Think about it, he said. The metal workers are making things for the interior of the temple. To work metal, you need to heat it up and then pour it into a mold to shape it unless you are making gold leaf.
Oh, Zachary said, his face lighting up.
I get it.
Well, good. Tell me, Nathan demanded. It doesn't make any sense to me why a metal worker would be in a clay pit. There's less trees and wood for stoking your fire. His cousin laughed.
Oh, yeah, that's true, but they need something to make the molds out of. They make the molds in the clay pits. That's right,
Grandfather said with a smile. But I've seen metal workers work before, Nathan protested, and they brought the clay and the molds to where they were working.
Yes, Grandfather replied. That would usually be easier, but it also depends on what they're working on. For the smaller things, some of the basins and spoons and incense burners, that could be practical. But they have some huge pieces to prepare for the temple that could not be made anywhere else. They dig the actual molds for them in large pits in the ground. This week we will check on the pillars for the front of the temple. It will have 2 huge bronze pillars that will nearly be as tall as the temple itself. Something that size takes a huge mold, and it was easier to construct the molds here in the clay pits than up in Jerusalem.
As Grandfather finished explaining, the boys rounded the curve and saw exactly what he meant. "Oh, they're huge!" his grandsons exclaimed.
Is the temple really that tall? I'm sure they've measured it, Grandfather said, but these pillars do look enormous.
The pillars had already been cast and loaded onto long wooden carts.
Take a look, Grandfather suggested. Here are the pits they were molded in.
The boys peered down into one of them. Then Zachary playfully shoved Nathan. Slipping on the smooth clay, Nathan tumbled into the pit. Grandfather laughed and gave Zachary a shove. He slid in next to his cousin.
Look at this,
Zachary shouted.
I can stand up all the way in the mold. These pillars are as wide as I am tall.
His cousin laughed. Yeah, well, those pillars are a couple inches short of being as wide as I am tall. I'm glad I don't have to live inside of one. The boys giggled.
Hey, let's lie head to toe and see how long these things are, Zachary suggested. We'll find out how many of us could fit inside one of these pillars.
Zach and Nathan took turns as they measured out the length of the clay mold. 7, Nathan shouted. It could fit 7 of us standing on each other's shoulders. Grandfather laughed.
Those aren't quite the measurements the workmen were going by, but I guess that works.
He turned to the metal worker.
How much do these 2 pillars weigh? Do we have any idea?
The man shook his head. Ugh, I have no idea. These things are so huge they're unweighable now. And they took such huge quantities of brass to cast them, none of us knew. Grandfather nodded.
I'm sure that's true. It's a good thing that King Solomon has the wealth to provide for all these things. This will be the most magnificent building ever constructed.
The boys continued to play in the clay molds as Grandfather and the men talked about basins and lavers and other temple needs. Then he shouted,
Come on, boys, look at this one over here. You'll like this too.
What is it? They asked. The object was huge.
Well, said Grandfather, by you boys' way of measuring things, I guess it would take about 9 of you standing on each other's shoulders to span this.
It's true, said Nathan, who was a little better at math than Zach. What is it for? It looks like a huge basin.
It is,
the workman said, although you'd be quite a giant to need one of these for a bath. I'll say, Nathan agreed. Who's going to be bathing in this?
Only the priests, Grandfather explained. They have 10 other lavers for washing sacrifices, but this huge one is just for them.
But why so big? The boys chorused.
Everything has been planned to be as magnificent as possible, to remind people of our glorious God, Grandfather Ethan told them.
It's going to look even bigger, the metalworker told the 2 boys. We're casting cattle right now. There are going to be 3 bronze cattle facing east, 3 west, 3 south, and 3 north, all supporting the basin. So the priest will need steps to get up to it.
This will be a wonderful thing to play in,
Zachary whispered wistfully. Nathan frowned at him. Zachary, it's sacrilegious to even think such a thing. It's for the temple, remember? His cousin looked apologetic.
It is truly magnificent, and I try really hard to think reverent thoughts, but every once in a while, these things just pop into my head.
Grandfather had overheard him and started to laugh.
I imagine, he said with a chuckle, that the Mighty One does not forget that you were little boys not so long ago. Apparently he likes little boys anyway, or he wouldn't have made so many of them.
Nathan smiled, but Zachary squirmed uncomfortably. He hadn't realized Grandfather was listening. Grandfather resumed his discussion with the metalworkers. Yach, the metalworker commented.
Right now we're at about 6,000 talents of gold just for the interior of the most holy place, and we have no idea how much we've put into the rest of it. By the way you boys measure things, Grandfather commented, the gold in the holy place would weigh about the same amount as 40 of you. Both boys shook their heads. Neither had come from wealthy homes. They couldn't imagine that much gold. However, for a temple for their god, only the best was good enough, and as much gold as King Solomon wanted to put into it was fine with them. You must feel greatly honored to be working on these things for the temple, Zachary exclaimed to one of the metalworkers. The man laughed hoarsely. Oh, yeah, really honored. I'm real honored to work in gold for any god that'll pay me well. Nathan and Zachary were astonished. Grandfather Ethan's mouth pressed into a firm line, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. Speaking of which, the man said to Grandfather, did your god happen to send the monthly payment along with you on this trip? Yes, Grandfather Ethan said as calmly as he could. I left it with the supervisor, as always. He gestured toward the tent where another officer worked. Well, I have one thing to say, the workman continued, oblivious to Grandfather's anger. The God of Israel at least is a little more prompt with paying his bills than some we've worked for. Several of the metalworkers around him laughed. Grandfather turned on his heel and strode away. The boys hurried to keep up with him. It was half an hour before he slowed his pace. That metalworker was terribly disrespectful, Nathan blurted, still thinking about the incident. Yes, Grandfather agreed, he was. And he's fortunate that the God of Israel is merciful and slow to anger. Didn't strike him dead with a lightning bolt like I might have enjoyed doing right then. Surely the boys thought their God was patient and merciful to put up with such disrespect. Wouldn't it have been better to get, Israelites to do the fine metal work for the sanctuary? Nathan asked. I have heard that King Hiram sent these men from Tyre. Yes, but do you want to hear something even more amazing? They are descendants of Israelites. That craftsperson you were talking to, who was so disrespectful, is a direct descendant of Aholiab. Really? Both boys asked at once. They knew Aholiab from the stories their father had told them when they were little. The man had been a slave in Egypt and had learned metalworking there. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, Aholiab received the honor of making the Ark of the Covenant and all the sacred metalwork furnishings within the first sanctuary that Moses had erected in the wilderness. How could that be? Zachary exclaimed. He was so, rude. Yes. Through the years, our people apparently didn't pay enough, and the descendants of Aholiab found that they could make much better money casting metal objects for the kings of the other nations around us. Business was pretty good. That fellow we spoke to, Huram, was actually from the tribe of Daud, or at least his mother was. His father was from Tyre. He's more interested in getting wealthy than serving the God of his mother. The boys solemnly nodded. I had to agree with them on this one. It seemed to those of us observing that Solomon might have been better off using local metal smiths who, while perhaps less experienced than the skilled workers from Tyre, would have had more respect for the God they were working for. After all, because they would be committed to him, he would have endowed them with the skills they needed to make the holy things for his home. It was the Mighty One who gave the skills to Aholiab and his sons in the first place. There was no reason why he could not do it again. Still, these were the choices Solomon had made, and in spite of the greed of the metalworkers, God was blessing the building project. It was hard to believe that almost 2 years had passed since the boys had come to live with their grandfather. The air almost buzzed around them with excitement. The temple was at last finished. It seemed as if they had been practicing their songs for the dedication forever, singing each one again and again to make sure it was absolutely perfect. It finally makes sense to me, Nathan said. What finally made sense? His cousin asked. Well, it never made sense to me, he said, that the ark was in the place with the king, but the high priest was banished out to his country home, and the tent of meeting with the bronze altar was in Gibeon. Where was God's real residence? Well, I don't think it was that big a deal to God, Zachary commented. After all, he's the king of the universe. The earth is just his footstool. I know, but the whole reason for having the tent of meeting and the entire wilderness tabernacle was so that he would have a place where he could be near us. And then it was all split up, and I always wondered which one he was actually at. Zachary laughed. Probably he can be more places in one at a time. He may not be made the same as we are. Nathan nodded. I'm sure it wasn't a problem to him, but it always bothered me.
I'm glad that he has a beautiful temple now. I just hope he will always want to be with us.
Why wouldn't he?
Zachary asked. Perhaps I phrased that wrong, Nathan said slowly. Perhaps I should have said, I hope that we always make him welcome.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Well, tomorrow's the big day. We still have things to do to get ready.
I finally figured something else out today, Nathan continued, totally ignoring Zachary's comment about preparing for the ceremony.
Heh, Ma, you been busy thinking today?
Zachary laughed.
What else did you figure out?
Why God wanted them to use cedar on the inside of the house.
Oh, that's easy. It's because it smells nice. The Lord wants things that are sweet smelling.
Well, if that's true, Nathan smirked, you're in real trouble.
Zachary burst out laughing. Well, I don't think God minds people who go sweaty practicing to sing for him. Better than somebody who smells good and just sits around and doesn't praise him.
Yeah, perhaps God is like your mom.
What does that mean?
His cousin demanded. Well, she just adores you no matter how you smell because you're her son. As Zachary reluctantly nodded, Nathan continued, unlike the rest of us who would really appreciate you bathing before the ceremonies tomorrow. After Zachary gave him a playful punch, the two were soon wrestling in the courtyard.
Hey, break it up, you two, Grandfather's voice ordered. Look, I have new robes for you two to wear tomorrow.
The boys caught their breath. They were white ephods like the other Levites wore, but they had beautiful blue tassels on the corners.
They look expensive,
Zachary blurted.
That's because they were, Grandfather commented, but you're worth it. And it's to celebrate the dedication of the temple, and the Lord is worth it. Besides, in Moses' law, God said that all the sons of Israel should wear at least one thread of blue in their garment.
The deep blue dye was very expensive because the snails that the dye was made from came from the ocean and were very tiny. It took many of them to produce just a small amount of pure dye. Thank you, Grandfather, the boys said together.
This broadcast has come from the book Exile of the Chosen by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.